had a conversation with CDC and they were telling us all about this wonderful breast and cervical cancer program and how can they get combinations involved under the BCC program and I said, well, did participate in that yeah. They will not be able to explain it because they're serving the people that they serve. She's our case manager, and she will have questions. They don't have that anymore. And I will. She has case manager. People want to see growth, and the growth every year. That's yeah.
Hello everyone, I'm Anna. I'm going to be moderating today. So all sessions are being recorded and will be available for viewing up to 3 months following the conference using links in your agenda and calendar invites. Materials available for this session are provided by the presenter and those are available in the app or online. So this is one of the series in our Improving Patient Care Through Data track. Our final session is going to be on data sovereignty, and I'd like to introduce our presenter, Christy Duke. We can also wave to the Zoom people, hello, every virtual attendee. So Ms. Duke has been instrumental in building USET's Tribal Epidemiology Center program, coming to the organization in May of 2003 and strengthening processes over the next 19 years. Ms. Duke also serves as the director of USET's Tribal Epidemiology Center. She has graduated in 2001 with a master's in public health degree from Tulane University School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. Thank you for being here today, Christy.
Thank you. Well, it's nice to see everybody. It looks like most of y'all were in the evaluation session right before this. I'm the one in the back that hates evaluation, I'll admit it. It's not my favorite thing. I actually like to know the results of evaluation, and I love the digital storytelling, but planning for evaluation, I'm a very black and white person. I want to have confidence. That's what I want to do. I don't, I don't want to have to, how was it successful? People like it. I'm good to go now. That's my evaluation. But thank God I have Emily and her team to keep me straight on that. But Emily's session did bring up a good point that I would like to acknowledge ahead of time. I'm an epi, I love data, that's what I do. I manipulate data, I do all of those things. I'd like to acknowledge and respect the fact that data is so much more than numbers. It's the digital storytelling, it's the knowledge that tribal communities hold. And I want to, if I focus too much on data, just realize that's my own bias and what I do professionally, but know that I want to include all of that when I'm speaking, that I acknowledge that that's included. I want to start out by showing just a brief video, and then I'm going to go over a couple of definitions, and then I really like to have dialogue, kind of like Emily does, and pick everybody's brains and just talk things out. I think this is a very important topic. This term, data sovereignty, came to my attention, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. We'd always been talking about this issue, but I never had a term for it prior to that. And it's really kind of come to a head, and it seems like Indian country has embraced this term. I've seen it more and more since that time. And I really, really love it because I think it really captures the principles of what everybody is trying to do. So with that said, let's go ahead and start the first video, or the video, and then we'll go over the definitions. Oh, I'd like to introduce, sorry, Anna Garrett, who is also one of our FEs within USET, and I don't think we have the FEs in here, but
This is a video.
it should be, yeah. Is it not playing?
Do you have a link in the?
Oh, I don't know what happened. I did have a link in there, and then we tried to embed it, so I don't know. Maybe text Mark and then we can come back to it, or Angela. I'm fine, I can adjust. So that video was really geared towards research, and I just wanted everybody to be aware of that, thinking more broadly about what, again, tribal data is, and that sort of thing. But I think that really frames the issue very well, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. So what is tribal data sovereignty? It's the right of a nation to govern the collection, ownership, and application of its own data. It derives from a tribe's inherent right to govern their peoples, land, and resources. And that's the University of Arizona has a collaborative for indigenous data governance, which I think is really fantastic and really needed. I think this topic comes up again and again and again. In a minute, I'm going to go over comments just that I heard during this conference around this issue. So we talk about it, I don't think without realizing that we're talking about it, but that's really at the heart of things what we're talking about. So that's data sovereignty. It's just the right to govern the data and how it works. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So as I was researching this, a couple of other terms came up, and I thought I'd go ahead and include them in there because they're all kind of interrelated. So what is data residency? It's where data is stored, where it is physically stored. It's subject to the laws of the country or the tribal nation or the whatever, where it's physically stored. Data subjects, any person whose personal data is being collected, held, or processed will have different privacy and security protections according to where the data centered housing, where they're housing the data at. So this really focuses on the protection of the individual. And that is, this is from a website of like IT professionals who are all into this. And I think what's missing from this definition is, does anybody want to take a step? What's missing from a tribal, if you're looking at this from, I think from a tribal lens, we're protecting the individual, but we're not protecting
Sovereignty.
Sovereignty in the community as a whole. And I think that's the fundamental difference when we talk about protections that's different in Indian country, that we're equally concerned about protection of the community, as we obviously don't want to identify anybody, you know, in a data set and make it identifiable by drilling down too much. But we also want to protect the community. We're all familiar with the Havasupai. Is anybody not familiar with Havasupai in that case? You're not aware of it? Okay, I'll give you a brief. No, that's okay. It's important. So Havasupai, hi Mark. I had a link in here in my file to show a video and it wasn't working. So and you can reduce this because I'm just talking if you need to. So Havasupai, what they chose to participate, I believe it was a diabetes study, and they took blood samples and all those sorts of things and did genetic testing. And if I'm getting the facts wrong, somebody just interject. So they did that and they agreed to it and they published the results. Okay, great, fine. The researchers kept the blood samples and then did a study without Havasupai's permission. I believe it was on mental health, maybe was it schizophrenia or something like that? Yeah. That was incredibly, it didn't identify, it protected the individuals. So from an institutional review board and an ethical perspective, It didn't violate any of those things, but from a tribal perspective, it absolutely did because it was damaging to the community as a whole. So that's something that researchers, public health, the larger public health system, that is a constant conversation about protecting the community. And that's something that the data residency misses, and that tribal data sovereignty kind of captures. So that's important to note.
We can play the video now if you want.
Do you mind to play it real quick? Okay, go ahead. Thank you, Mark. You're so.
First Nations people have always understood the value of community, the importance of respect, and the need to protect our resources for future generations. And today, one of our most important resources is information. First Nations people have always been information gatherers. When we track and hunt or gather food from the land, we're engaging in information gathering that has a direct and important impact on our lives. First Nations people understand that information isn't just about numbers and surveys. It's about culture, identity, traditions, and self-determination. That's why the First Nation Information Governance Center was created. Since 1996, its mission has been to uphold the values of OCAP, a set of principles designed to protect First Nations ownership and jurisdiction over their information and ensure that First Nations people are the stewards of their own information. OCAP ensures that First Nations people have ownership both individually and collectively as a community. It puts them in control so that they can decide how it is used, by whom, and under what conditions. It ensures that they have the right to determine and define access regardless of where it is held. And it defines possession, ensuring that they have the power to use their information for the benefit of their own communities. Possession is key to making ownership, access, and control possible. Taking together, the First Nations principles of OCAP embody one important idea, that First Nations people understand their own needs and are in the best position to govern their own information. The right of First Nations communities to own, control, access, and possess information about their peoples is fundamentally tied to self-determination and to the preservation and development of their culture.
First Nations Information Governance Center is a national body that supports First Nations from across Canada in advancing our interests around information and data management and governance.
Their job is essentially to assert First Nations ownership, control, access, and possession into the data collection and survey research which is being done in the country. I think their primary goal is to make sure that First Nations are directly involved in every aspect, and in fact, they have taken the lead in a couple of major surveys in the country.
Basically, our mission is to support local and regional capacity for data and information collection, interpretation, analysis, and translating it into knowledge, and then making it available to leadership for good, sound decision-making, evidence-based decision-making.
For First Nations, this is important because it helps create a standard for their relationships that they have with researchers, and it creates an ethical space where they can facilitate the conversation around research and making sure that it's culturally appropriate and safe for the community to participate in.
Though OCAP is trademarked by the First Nations Information Governance Center, it is owned by the First Nations communities, and it helps them and guides them in the work that they do in research.
OCAP helps First Nations to have self-determination because the information is theirs.
The First Nation themselves are in the position to determine how their information is utilized, accessed, gathered, and interpreted. I think that's one of the important elements about OCAP is that First Nations have control of their information. They need to be part of the interpretation of that information as well.
It's important that they have the final say because ultimately this information is about them.
achieving recognition of our sovereignty and exercising our sovereignty is essentially the fundamental goal, and the purpose for exercising that, achieving that recognition and exercising that sovereignty is really to improve the quality of life of our people and to return to the balance in the government-to-government relationship.
We've got to have the ability to measure our well-being in terms that make sense to us. And we actually want that well-being described in positive terms. The RHS, or the Regional Health Survey, was an attempt by the federal government to actually gauge the well-being of First Nations across Canada. Being that we are a very diverse population and of huge geography, it's really challenging from an Ottawa perspective to actually measure what's going on in the community.
First Nations people understand that we're living in an evidence-based world. And in order to affect positive policy change for our communities, we need to have that credible data that we can quote and refer back to in order to gauge where we're going to go to next in the future.
First Nations people need to be the stewards of their own information because we know best what is the best processes for us, and we can manage our own information.
That information is crucial for us to also do our research. If we don't, then we don't have accurate information. You can't plan for a cohesive, healthy future.
Governance matters. Being able to actually define where you want to go and how you're going to get there is key. Being informed along the way is a very important aspect of that. The destination and the journey, two parts of it. The roadmap is what's going to get you there. And good information, good data management is actually the roadmap to the future.
The data localization slide. Okay, so the third concept, going back, we had data sovereignty, which is the right to govern, data residency, where the data lives and the laws surrounding that. Data localization, data created within certain borders and it stays within them. So the actual, if it's in a community, that the data stays there, it resides there, so it's related to sovereignty and residency. Now, here I would like to, if possible, hear some comments. Think about your, I'm talking, I'm sorry about that. Think about the data sets that you hold in your communities, or don't hold, the data related to your communities. If you could share your thoughts and as they relate to sovereignty, residency, and locality.
I think the most frustrating one for us at Seneca Nation is the localization, because we want to be able to share this within the Seneca Nation, but we're always very wary of publicizing, printing, having it on the internet, having it in any other form than basically in-person sharing, in-person presentation, or having like an official handoff and understanding that, you know, the community member that gets the information isn't going to pass it on outside of the tribe. Because we have had it not as far, not as sensitive information as the example that you brought up, but we've definitely had that happen to us, you know, where a local county says, you know, look at the local, you know, this poor tribal community that's within, you know, they want to say we're within our bounds, but we always assert that, you know, they're within ours, if anything. But they try to use our data to get grants or to leverage our statistics for their programs, but it's never on our terms.
Right, and do you see the results of a successful grant application to that applicant?
Most times.
Oh, well, that, at least you're seeing that. Some tribal nations, you know, they use their data and they don't see any results, any partnerships formed from that.
It's always on their terms though.
Yes.
We have to go off territory. We have to go to them to get these services. It's never offered on our terms or for the convenience of our people.
Where is that data coming from?
Usually the print, you know, the things that are accessible. It's not usually, word of mouth.
It's not Seneca data. I mean, meaning Seneca's not collecting it.
At times, yeah,
Okay.
there's been a few,
Okay.
we have like a really old research policy. It's from like 1988. And so we have this research policy that's kind of general for the nation. And our Seneca Nation Health Board is also trying to create one that's separate. So there's like a general research, but then they want a health specific research review committee. And it's just hard to see how those two are going to exist next to each other, because before it just depended on who you were. If you were an enrolled member and you were trying to do anything, thumbs up, good to go, no check-ins, no nothing. But if you were outside the community, then it's, here's all these hurdles along the way, and then they still walk away with the data with no strings attached. They can publish, they can share, this could be used for other purposes. We weren't really formalized or didn't have an infrastructure.
What about anybody else thinking about the data within your community?
And I guess to a certain extent, I can kind of concur with what their issues are, because we're in such a rural area that there's various communities within our area that, of course, when we look at data and the collection of it, like say, for example, COVID numbers, we're the only IHS facility within about a 20 to 30 mile radius from another IHS facility. So there's neighboring communities across the border that have to come to our IHS facility for treatment. So say if they're COVID positive, of course, the numbers, the data that's collected, to evaluate rising numbers, whatever have you. It looks, traditionally bad when you see the COVID numbers from IHS numbers, but you look at data that's been collected through our tribal, I guess, statistics, it's really fluctuating on so many different levels, and sometimes it's hard to get an understanding of how these funds and these particular resources are available to only specific communities and not necessarily us where everybody goes. And so it kind of makes, I think along the lines of what was shared earlier, where's the line, who's working harder for whatever is available, but at the same time, if it's, from our IHS facility, why is that IHS facility not retrieving a lot of those resources that are available? And I think a lot of it, even though we talk about localization, there's still territories within the localization. And I think a lot of this is the, impact that we're looking at from a standpoint of who, gets the funds, who gets the resources, who gets the, benefits that would actually benefit not only our community, but the outlying communities. And, we have our village, our pueblo, our community of zoning, but we also have Navajo communities just surrounding about 11 miles, 15 miles from where we are, and they have to drive, like I said, to our IHS, but, it's a matter of, that issue that was just brought up earlier, so that's one of the things that we also talk about, localization of data and records and, things like that. So.
I've got one comment. I think this is a really important discussion. And I would say that in the last maybe 10 years, technology has kind of evolved to facilitate the conversations here. I'm wondering, with your expertise, have you looked into anything like blockchain or anything like that?
I don't know what is that? I'm not familiar with that.
We can talk off.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll speak more about that.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, okay, I would love to hear more because I'm still learning on this topic. I did want to say, I work for USET, I'm with the Tribal Epicenter. For those of you who are not from a USET member tribe, our tribal nations, most of them have granted us access into RPMS, so we mine their data quite a bit. I think we're the only epicenter that has that. So when I'm talking, a lot of times that's what's in my head. It's not quite making sense to be not connecting the dots there. So just wanted to say that.
I know we had a big debate on data and data sharing recently at our facility. There's a big desire, I think, in rural areas to try to gain access to data to provide better care to patients. Most states have health record or data record exchanges. You know, in Maine, it's Maine Health InfoNet. And we had a huge desire to be able to gain, we're a rural clinic, not hospital serving. So a lot of our patients will go out for PRC care. And the conversation obviously was, we'd love to have a lot of this data, but we need to be conscientious of our data. So we had lots of conversations with the information exchange, and I believe we're one of 2 read-only facilities that Maine Health InfoNet has, because we want the data. That's data from our patients, but we're not blanketly, there's no way that we're just going to blanketly send all our data off-site. And that was very rare for them. And of course, from a health info exchange, they want our data too.
Who was they?
They would be the health information exchange, because, you know, if somebody needs to go to an emergency room, it would be nice for that emergency room to have that data. But we're not blanketly going to release that data. And once the context was explained to that organization, they're like, we wholeheartedly understand. We still believe that it will be a great asset to your organization to get the data for your patients, and we understand that you're not going to be sharing data back. But that took a lot of legwork to get to that point, and a lot of, you know, IT vetting and a lot of information technology systems to be put in place to make sure and guarantee that we were receiving the access we needed for our patient population, but we weren't sharing in the other direction.
Well, and I think that's important to know. I spent a considerable amount of time, Anna is fairly new to us, but she will be spending a considerable amount of time as well. It's that whole getting people that are not working and living in Indian country to understand that the protection of the community is vital. And that's a prime example. Absolutely, we need to protect individuals' privacy. But at the same time, protect, and it's just the default. They are not thinking that. And that should be concurrent thinking at all times. And getting people to frame that through that lens. Does anybody else have anything? Okay, so let's back up. So is anybody in disagreement with the principles of data sovereignty? Most people are not. Tribal data. Yes, we believe that that's tribal data. It's owned by the tribes, should be governed by the tribes. That's the general principle. I'd like to shift gears and talk in practice how that actually works or doesn't work, and talk through that just a little bit. So first of all, we have to talk about, when we talk about the community, we have to talk about our numerators and our denominators. What are we looking at, and who is the community we're looking at? So if we could let's start with the community. Who is your community?
depends on who you ask. Some people, like for our clinic, we like to look at all of our patients. We do, you know, the administration, all that. If you're looking at our government, the Senate Nation, they would like to know the enrolled members. But we don't have or service all the enrolled members. So there's going to be missing data for Seneca enrolls. But we have, you know, a whole system to look at. So it's hard for us to differentiate what they actually want versus, you know, we have more numbers if you look at everything.
Yeah.
And if you're gonna piece out our population, you know, our patients served, then the data is just naturally gonna be more inaccurate because you're looking at just who we have.
Anybody else? Who is your community?
I think that answer varies depending on a wide variety, including geography. You know, in Maine, there are 5 tribal clinics for 4 tribes. And as people have moved, you know, that changes for an area that has 1 tribe for a huge geographical area. I think that's going to look a lot different. We have, speaking of enrollment, we have more total patients than our tribe's enrollment. Because of the main tribes, although rural, we are the most urban. So there has been a flocking to our area of other tribal members from all over the geography. But that might look different in another place.
Right.
Ours is just, anyway, when we just trying to remember.
Okay.
I work mostly with diabetic and data. And a lot of times we're looking at the new diagnosed diabetics. And we're looking at taking that person and that group of people and looking at all their labs and all that kind of stuff so we can know where to start with their treatment.
I think that's really, did anybody have anything else? Sorry.
I kind of have something to add. It's a little different. So I work with Map that just received recognition in 2018. And there's 650 people in the tribe, and maybe a third of them live in the state of Virginia. And there's a third close to Philadelphia, and then the rest are all spread over. So it's kind of hard, like community in a way is like a little bit different. And it's still very strong culturally, but it's hard when you don't have the same geographic bound that seems to kind of be in play with like this data localization.
Yeah, and I think that everything that you're saying is pretty specific to Indian country, and it plays into the nuances of data sovereignty and data governance and all of those issues, because it just depends. It depends on what community we're looking at. You know, do tribal nations have the right to examine data on their tribal citizens? Our position from USET is absolutely, of course they do. Do they have the right to look at the health and well-being of non-tribal citizens who are living in that area? Well, if we're looking at COVID, absolutely, because it affects other people in the community. So it also depends on what we're examining. Are we examining cancer? Are we examining COVID? What is it that we're looking at, Shayla?
I was just hearing,
Okay.
it's yeah.
So these nuances, that's the reality of the data that we deal with all the time. And these I'm not suggesting that these are really answerable questions. They really are not. But it plays into the difficulty that we all face around quality data, because all of these things have to be considered when we talk about tribal data. So I want to, just for a second, let's talk about where the breakdown occurs. We look at CDC Wonder, we look at the US Census. We all know that's wrong. It's generally always wrong. So let's go through, let's just take public health data for just a second. So we're just gonna make this random patient that comes into a tribal clinic, okay? They are diagnosed with COVID, measles, whatever communicable disease that they have. Or even they are referred out by a PRC and get cancer, and they have a cancer diagnosis, okay? So that information goes to, that's reportable to the state registries, right? So we're starting with tribal data. An enrolled citizen gets this diagnosis, and it's now feeding into a larger data set, okay? So that is tribal data. Does that information get returned to the tribal nation?
Most of the time.
Okay. Do we have a way to accurately assess those rates? Because again, who is our community now? So if we're looking at state or federal data sets and we're pulling out, okay, give me all the American Indians, Alaska Natives in the state with condition X, our numerator is now including a lot of people who are either not enrolled citizens, may not lived in the Chista, you know, just many of it, however you're defining community, you're not able to parse that out. Okay, so with the denominator, when you use those data sets, what denominator, what bottom number do you use when you calculate the rate? You can't use, well, you could, but methodologically, using your user pop or whatever with a state data set it just doesn't work. You know, you need to use the same data set to be able to calculate those rates. So that information is, in order to do that, you really have to have a line level listing. So I know that this person is an enrolled tribal citizen, almost like a sub-registry. Does that make sense? So tribal nations are able to parse that information out on a tribal nation specific level. Yes, we can pull it down at a state level. However, then we run the risk of, in our area, the denominators are way off on the census, which is usually used for state and federal data sets. Probably 7-8 years ago, I did an analysis of the the American Indian Alaska Native alone population in Florida. And the US Census says that population was about 100,000. But when I look up the total enrollment of Miccosukee Seminole, and I just cut Porch right in half, it's about 10,000. So that's a huge discrepancy. And when you're dividing, say, 24 cancer cases, do you use 10,000? Do you use hundreds of thousands? I mean, that's going to give you a very vastly different rate. And that's the problem that we're facing, is that the sovereignty of the data, that data is really, you can get it, but you really can't. You really can't, because it's so hard to parse out on a tribal level. It's impossible unless you match by person. Has anybody been successful about getting data from their state on the tribal level? That these rates are for this specific, the community that you specify, we want to know this rates for these communities.
With your immunization, we pull out data from state or immunization.
Yeah, and that's one of the rare exceptions, is the immunization, because there's that sharing back and forth. Has anybody else been able to do that?
Not even with immunizations for us, nothing.
I've had some success with a local hospital network that we've increased relationships with.
Nice, good.
There's full county records, and it's for like homelessness and stuff like that.
Yeah. So all of these factors play into it. And what the point that I'm trying to get at is, it seems to me that so many data points and surveys and analyses and registries are flowing in one direction, but not flowing in the other direction. So that data is starting at a tribal level. It is now tribal tribal data and it is going somewhere. And, but that loop is not closed. And when you think, let's just, as an example, I know, do y'all go over to Vermont at all, Shayla? I know Mohawk does sometimes. So St. Regis Mohawk, some of their tribal citizens, it's in New York State, they go across the border to Vermont for services. So say they have a reportable condition, they get cancer, but it's diagnosed in New York State, in Vermont. Ideally, that information would go back to New York State because they're a resident of the state. It should also be going back to St. Regis Mohawk, but it is not. And that's the issue that we're facing, is that loop is never closed. And we have no way to know when, if you look at the registry and pull it out, are these 32 or whatever American Indians, Alaska Natives, are they enrolled tribal citizens? Are they part of the community that we are measuring? And we don't know. Next slide. So I have this, and I'm just going to ask you, what are your COVID rates? What are your diabetes rates? What are your mortality rates? What are your X rates? Whatever. Does anybody really know?
I know our mortality rate at our tribe is, COVID is, it's real high.
Yeah.
I mean, we had like 7 or 8 die when we, COVID. But I don't know the percentage, because I haven't gotten a report yet.
And that is one thing, the mortality project that USET and Porch is doing, they're getting their own mortality records, and we're able to say, of this community, however we define it, there are this many people that passed away from whatever. But that's really one of the few that we have.
Our diabetes rate is about average right now.
Right, but the diabetes rate is based on the clinic population. Yes.
That's just what I was going to say. All our rates are based upon our user population.
Right.
But that, I think there was a mention before that we have some Penobscots that don't use on-site services. And we also have members of the other 3 tribes in Maine who are using services. And more than just the other 3 tribes in Maine, but from Maine to Alaska Natives and everywhere in between. And then my question always comes into my mind of, okay, so part of our user population uses for just part of the health department and then may use their home tribe for the rest of their care. So they're in our user population. They come for our dental services, but somehow we get notice that they've got cancer. So they're in our cancer rates, but they're also in, Micmac's cancer rates, or they're in Passamaquoddy's cancer rates. And so, yeah, it's best case epidemiology, I guess, is the way that we end up with numbers.
Anybody else have anything? So this really just gets to the point of, we really don't know hardly anything in Indian country, because all of these nuances play into the realities that we deal with. So, we love the concept of data sovereignty, and when I was researching this, data locality too, because really it's, where is it and who has physical control of it? That's really the issue. We can say all day long, this is tribal data, we have the right to access it. But unless we're really willing, we still haven't gotten that information back. That sovereignty is not being upheld. And so I think that locality may have to be the goal eventually. And how do we protect that? And this is a larger question than just health. I know that we're all health people, but it matters. But a couple of years ago, what was it, right before COVID? No, it was right as COVID started. And I don't know all the details because this is not my field, but there was a housing calculation made, I think through BIA, and the denominator they used was way, way off. And so it affected tribal nations in a very real way, because it was it was undercounting people. So there is, there's no consensus on what is it, who are we counting? How do we measure this? And I think that that's gonna come to a forefront because it seems to be coming up again and again and again with census numbers, with housing numbers, with IHS numbers. There's so many different ways to measure these things that I think the larger public health system is not aware of. The person who spoke yesterday, the panel discussion about data and transgender people and being able to measure that and the issues that they face. It's the same issue I think that we are facing in Indian country is it's just not set up to measure that right now. They have wedged Indian country health and Indian country data, and it's just become this other. The difference is that there is the treaty and trust obligation of the United States to uphold data sovereignty and to provide for the health and well-being. And that really is the fundamental difference, I think, between Indian country and other groups of people. So having said that, if tribal nations have a right to their own data, what's happening? Why are they not getting that?
I think it goes back to the territorialistic viewpoint of tribal officials, perhaps. It's unfortunate, but a lot of the times when you're working in the government sector, that's the biggest issue, when it pertains to data, because as an organization, we can try so hard to request the data in the hopes of utilizing that data to create a project and create, a program that will be beneficial to not only the community, but the up and coming, individuals. But it always seems that the overall issue is, well, we need an MOA. We don't have this in place. We don't have that in place. These boundaries, these hoops, these flames are always lit. And it, as you said earlier, where is the data? Where is this going? It stops basically right there. And a lot of the times, I think, as organizations, we become discouraged because this, as you said, is our data. This is our sovereignty as individuals to get a piece of this. We're amongst the few that are going to be sharing what is, us. Whether it's blood quantum, whether it's positive or negative for COVID, all of these is us. Yet we don't have a piece or a say in where and how we can acquire this data. So your question goes back to you. As a professional, how do we work through these?
We advocate legislation. That is something that we do. We have a C4 side of things, so we tend to advocate as much as we can, and we collaborate with our C4. We educate the CDC and partners over and over and over and over again. That's the only thing I know to do. I mean, I guess, you could file a court case. I don't see that happening, but I mean, it would be a possibility. It's just a continual educational process, and it's grinding. I've been doing this for 19 years now, and it's like, come on, y'all, we've written papers, just read the paper. I don't want to talk to you anymore about it. But it becomes very difficult. So I think that advocacy piece and speaking, and I asked the census lady yesterday, can tribal nations access your restricted data files? And I didn't really get an answer for that. How can census help? We will work with you. We will work with you to develop a statistical inquiry to get you the information you need. That's not what I asked. And so that has to be asked all the time. How are you including tribal nations in your programs? How are you counting tribal citizens? And even before that, what was your process for consulting tribal nations prior to collecting this data? Because I think that that's critical, and that's a really key point. It cannot be after the fact. It has to be beforehand. Because, can you, yeah, skip to the last, I'm going to just get to my final recommendations here. Because what happens is, if tribal nations are not consulted, and I mean real consultation beforehand, then data, they're left out of the equation about how it is collected in the first place. And then right then they lose control over that. And I will say what I would recommend, and I'm shifting gears from public health to any agreements that tribal nations, on occasion, one of our USET tribal nations will ask us to look over a data sharing agreement and just give recommendations on it. And I will say this, always, always, always specify that any data, any work product, any publication is under the control of the tribal nation, and that permission must be granted. All data must be returned to the tribe after the project is over with. And what I said, like especially qualitative data, keeping that in the tribal archives, because that's an important piece to know. I mean, that is a historical record. The video about Hazel earlier, I mean, 100 years from now, if her grandchildren look at that, that's a wonderful story for them. So putting that in there, consider forming a data advisory committee and or an institutional review board, a tribal institutional review board, because they are considering not just the individual protection to the community. And that's the sovereignty piece that everybody's missing. Can you go back a little bit? One more. So these are comments I heard at this meeting, and I just stuck this in there last night. Can tribal leaders access restricted census records? The answer was no. It was not said no, but it was loud and clear no. I don't know that for a fact. That was the subtext that I got. Inclusivity in yesterday's opening session, talking about transgender issues and native transgender issues and how they're represented in data sets. But again, that conversation has to be had at the beginning. It cannot happen at the end, because if it's not at the beginning, then it's not considered. Decolonizing data, I just really wanted to mention this because like the storytelling and the map that the Kiowa map that Emily showed in the session beyond that, those are important pieces of data as well. And I just wanted to acknowledge how important decolonizing data is. Abigail Hawk speaks on this much more eloquently and in much more detail than I can. And I don't want to speak for her because she does a fantastic job. Get on YouTube and watch it. If you have a free hour, it's amazing. We may have to invite her next year or something.
Can you say it again? Sorry.
Abigail Hawk. Here are the other two comments I heard, and I wrote them down just today. And I'm bad handling. Exclusion of AI and data and COVID-19 data. Sometimes it's just not included. It's just not, it's other. Well, that's not helpful to us. It's not helpful at all. Native rates are not high enough to justify funding. I heard that today. We see that over and over and over again. And I think if we can push the story of number one, data sovereignty, and again, looking at indigenous knowledge and all types of data, and really push that story so that tribal nations are in control of that information and how they share it, and getting that point across to people who are not involved in Indian country about why it matters. You know, I was thinking about old information from anthropological studies, and I've had questions to me, and I will say, okay, so from my knowledge of this community, this, and this is why this is this way. And somebody will say, well, can you document that? Can you back it up? Can you back up what you're saying with data? And I'm like, are you kidding me? So I have to be told something from a community, or a community has to tell their story. Then somebody writes it down, but only until that person writes it down is it valid or measurable? I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me. And so that's where we are, getting that message across within the larger context of the data systems in which we live. So I'll close with that, but I will say that I think advocacy is key, and just how are you including American Indians, federally recognized American Indians, Alaska Natives, because that's what the Treaty of Trust obligation is to. How are you including them? How are we included in this project? Over and over, it needs to be asked. So with that said, I do want to hear from y'all about what your struggles have been. I know I've heard some about your thoughts, ideas on data sovereignty, your challenges, data localization. How are we doing on time? Okay, got about 5 more. What data sets do you own? Do you have in your, that you're able to exert your full sovereignty over?
EHR data?
For your 638?
Yeah.
Anybody else? And I realize that I'm speaking of data sets as opposed to the larger data issue, but you know, when we talk about surveys and numbers and things like that, what data sets do you have that you have full sovereignty over? Anything else? Anybody done a survey within their community? Okay. So you would retain sovereignty over that. Enrollment. Are there any other ones? Does anybody keep a registry of anything? Come on. Your what registry, Sheila?
Yeah, I have one registry.
Your mortality registry?
Our diabetes and our smoke concession and our dental, we're doing one for dental now for fluoride and treatment. And so, yeah, and it's like pulling a nail out of a board to get some data from others, you know, from the state, see what our population didn't get, what they're doing, say.
Yeah.
And then we have a COVID panel, so it was their panel and all this stuff.
So I think the realization and the advocacy piece is key of just really advocating for tribally generated data, where it goes, who accesses it, when they access it, how they access it, and making sure that loop is closed. And that's going to be difficult because the larger public health system and the larger system itself was not set up to include Indian country. So I mean, it is an ongoing struggle that we have with data and information. Just a couple of quick issues with data. I just want to touch on that. And this just goes to while we all agree with the principles of data sovereignty, how difficult it is actually to put into practice. There was one on, the IHS mortality study. This is a legacy thing that IHS did from way back, and with our IHS partners, and the struggle I face as an epidemiologist, but also as an advocate at USET, is this IHS mortality study goes through, gets all of it does a linkage with the National Center of Health Statistics and the data that resides in the National Data Warehouse that IHS holds. They do a linkage, and then they're able to publish to get results of mortality rates in Indian country, and it is improving the data, and which is great. However, that never went through consultation, and it really should have. So USET is probably going to issue a position on that at some point about, and I really struggled with this, and all the other tribal epidemiology center directors were a little bit mad at me because I was like, it's great that they're improving the data, but they didn't go through tribal consultation. So, you know, putting that, my scientific hat on and my advocacy hat on, we're sometimes split. So we're probably going to push back on that because it is a legacy project from way, way back. Yes.
You mentioned earlier that there's any legal cases, since it's subject to the laws and structures within the nation. You think you see that coming if they're trying everything, advocating and that, hey, we're gonna have to do something now? And
could be. You know, I'm not a legal expert on Indian country law, so I know there's so many nuances with that. So I don't know, maybe.
and could that be a part of it as well? The reason why they, you know, like you said, the tribal leaders can't access those records and yet, because there's their own jurisdiction and yet, but they're subject to the law. So
yeah, maybe. It's an idea. IHS RPMS access, and I'll just touch on that and then we'll wrap up since we're running over, I'm sorry. As I mentioned, most of the tribal nations have granted, the USET tribal nations have granted us access into their EPIs, just a subset of us, into their RPMS, and we provide them statistics back. We have a few in our area that are not 638. They are federally run direct service tribal nations. And tribal leaders have said, we want USET to access RPMS so they can provide us with the same reports they provide to the other tribal nations. The tribal leaders have said, and IHS has said no. So, you know, they don't have sovereignty over that. So it becomes very difficult. So I'll close there and give anybody a chance to share any parting thoughts. It is a complex issue. There are a lot of nuances to it, but it is so critical, I think, to the work that we do. And I really think that sovereignty, and I am going to really try to start speaking in terms of sovereignty and locality because I think that's the direction that we need to go. Anybody else have any comments? Thank y'all. I really appreciate it.
Please do your evaluations. Thank you.
We have rights to the survey.
Sure, yeah.